Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 20 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Laura Porto Stockwell. She's the CEO and founder of Big Thinkers Society, a digital agency here in Seattle. I'm going to ask Laura, I just want to say one thing. She has this, we were talking before we started about this sort of, there's this many pathways into content strategy. And Laura's was from journalism to digital strategy to content strategy, and sort of from a journalistic setting into the agency world. And then there's done a lot of interesting things in there. So let me have Laura talk a little bit more about her background. And welcome,
Sure.
Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really great to see you and to be here, and of course to talk about content strategy, which is near and dear to my heart. So yeah, as you mentioned, I got my start in journalism. I have a traditional journalism degree. I'm going to date myself, but I went off to Prague when kind of people were there and writing. I spent some time there as a journalist. And then when I came back, I worked for a couple different newspapers. And because I was a new reporter, I did a lot of community reporting, which actually really nicely translated into digital, because there's so much community and social, even in the early days on digital. So I felt like I was kind of primed for that. And my first digital job was actually at the Seattle Times in 1994, and I was hired as their first online digital reporter. So that was my kind of crossover into the digital world. And I did all sorts of things, including we had a bulletin board system before our website, so we posted the entire newspaper every day online. And I also the reporter on the online community, and I set up all of their social. So we used Usenet, I moderated all their communities. So it was just like an amazing experience. And from there, I spent the next almost 20 years at agencies, everything from Razorfish to March 1st to Publicis, and some local agencies here in Seattle, and also in LA, San Francisco, New York, and Milan, Italy. So I've really been able to kind of have that agency experience, build groups, both content strategy groups and digital strategy groups, over the last 20 years. And then the last 4 years, I've been out on my own, running my own agency called Big Thinkers Society.
Nice. I want to ask a little bit about March 1st, because there was this right at the dawn of the web. That was like 98, I think you started there. And the web was just getting rolling. And, I was around back then. I was doing online publishing stuff. And it was so prototypical and clunky and not very brandy, and it just, we were making stuff up and trying to figure things out on the go. But there was this kind of like, I interviewed, I don't know if you know Natasha Bonta McDermott. I interviewed her a few episodes ago. She was over at what was Climate Mock's agency, Studio Archive. And so Studio Archive's going March 1st, but March 1st was, tell me about March 1st. Was it how did that arise? And
I can tell you the whole story, which is just fascinating. So I moved to San Francisco in 1998, and I got hired at an agency called Iconic Interactive. It was one of the big three agencies in San Francisco, which in 98 was basically almost the only big three agencies, right? And so in any case, I was doing proposal writing there, and I was integrating a bit with the content strategy group. They actually had a content strategy group because they came out of CD-ROM development. So they were heavy on content. And there was our fearless leader there was Eric Johnson, who was a total visionary when it came to content strategy, and some amazing people like Trace Cohen, and just a great group. And so originally I was hired at Iconic. I got there a few months later. They were purchased rather by a company called US Web, who had bought up every little web agency in the country, basically. And then a few months after that, we merged with an agency called CKS, which did the Yum campaign, if you remember that, for Apple. So they were like a traditional agency. And then a little while later, we were purchased, merged, and eventually became March 1st. And I'll tell you, on March 1st of every year, I still get an email from all my old colleagues from like 20 years ago it's March 1st. Anyway, so the company was launched on March 1st, and it was a global agency, and it was incredibly successful. It was, I can't remember the size of it, but I helped, so I was in San Francisco. I moved to LA, which is when we came March 1st, started content strategy and ran content strategy for the Southwest region, which was essentially Los Angeles and Phoenix. And then at some point, I can't remember, maybe it was 99, maybe it was 2000, with the syncing of the web, they were taken down with it. So they no longer exist. But a lot of those companies were, interestingly, purchased by a holding company for years. When I ended up at Razorfish in 2004 in New York City to start their content strategy group under Karen McGrain, it was like the holding company that picked up all the pieces. So anyways, it's all connected in the background. But that was like the short, glorious run of March 1st. And it was pretty amazing. It was early days, but we were working on huge clients like Sony Music and, big web development.
What were in that era, what were the components of content strategy? Like, how did you articulate it, and how did it manifest in your workflow, work processes?
It's such a good question. So just to back up a little bit, when I was at the Seattle Times, I was hired as an online reporter, and I co-founded a little group there called Seattle Times WebWorks. So in 1996, we launched a small web development team that was basically building websites for advertisers. So in Seattle, if you're a Seattle native, you'll notice like the Red Balloon Company. We built their first website in 1996 or 7, right? Like Bonnie Watson Funeral Home, all the local folks that were advertising with the Times, we did their website development. And at the time, right, like it was basically you needed a developer and a designer, and content was not thought to be. It was like the client was going to produce content, and they basically would give us a paper brochure that we would type in. That's how content worked in 1996, 97 on the web, at least my memory of it. Mm-hmm. So, at some basic level, if you have a 1-page, 2-page, 3-page website, you could get by with that at that time. But as websites got to be more like experiences, and as they got deeper, we realized that, a brochure doesn't necessarily translate. So, at that point, you really need to understand like what content should be there, when should it be delivered. We started getting into like dynamic delivery and, all of that, right? And so, I remember being in Los Angeles, and I wish I still had it. I can't find it, but it was this little like 2-minute video we made to explain content strategy. And it basically was like someone sitting at a desk, and the client, we had a fake client, like it was kind of cartoony, come over, and they put like, a napkin down with notes on it, or they put down literally like yellow pages, like, and they were like, put this online, and then we talked about our process and how we integrate with UX and design and development. And at the end, I kid you not, it's like a designer and a UX person and a content person skipping through a park together. I mean, it's hilarious. I wish I had it. It was so funny. But point being is like, that was always, and still today, it's like one of the number one reasons for site delays or social launch delays or whatever is people don't have the content. They think it's easy. They think that, if they can type, they have the content. They think, well, I have all this content over here. Can't you just throw it online? But, I'm sure, or I'll guess that you had similar experiences, is that it doesn't translate. And so we really had to figure out what was that process for content strategy. And it's a process that, interestingly, I have a lot of that documentation from those days. And it's something that, we've developed over the years. I had literally a content strategy process that started with, strategy, really understanding business goals and market needs and user, moving into kind of structural, like how are we going to set up, what's the taxonomy and the metadata and the SEO and all of that, moving into the creation piece, right? Because you don't start with writing, right? And right. So, then we get to creation, and then the maintenance piece, which is really key. When I actually in 2004, I joined Razorfish. I worked, I was the content strategist on a very large Fortune 10 company website. I won't name their name, but you would know them if I named them. And, the first thing I did is I did a content audit. just to see like what's on their site. They had about 1,000 pages of content on their site. I literally looked through every page. And, a lot of the stuff said like, this is 2004. It would say like next year in 2002, we're going to do this, so like you have to have all those processes in place. People didn't realize to maintain content. So, we started developing that process then. And I think it's still valid today. I mean, new things get added to it, but it still feels very valid.
Yeah. Well, that's it. That kind of, I think you just hit on some of the the reasons for the emergence and development of the field. Like you equally have these problems of like on the creation end, like so many, and I was kind of laughing as you were talking about that, because every content strategist, every content creator, every website developer I've ever talked to has struggled with prying content out of their client, whether they claim that they're going to blog regularly or whether it's getting budget to create the content, whatever it is, it's a struggle to always get that. And then at the other end, like you said, then it's like there's this, oh good, it's done, we can move on. It's like, no, you're actually not done. You have to have an ongoing strategy for dealing with it as well. Can you tell me, you mentioned right at the end there, you were talking about you had developed a process around that. How would you, kind of a top level, take me through how you craft a content strategy for a client?
Sure. So the first thing I do is really understand what exists. So, and let me back up a little bit, because now that I'm doing kind of broader digital strategy as well, we even start further back, which is really understanding what are your business goals and what's the market opportunity, right? So we'll do things like competitive auditing to really understand like where should you sit, because your website or your app or your social presence, whatever it is today, that is your brand, right? I mean, it took a while for corporations and organizations to realize like, oh yeah, it's not just my website, it's actually my brand online. So the first thing we do is we really figure that out. So we'll sit down with client, do intake, figure out what their business goals, what are they trying to do? What does the content need to support at the end of the day? Are there, for example, brand pillars that we need to support? Are we trying to sell something? Are we trying to recruit? Are we trying to promote the brand or a product? What is it what we're trying to do? But next we want to really understand like what's there, right? So we'll typically do a content audit, right? So we're basically looking at what exists. And in these days with very large scale websites, there's a lot of tools that you can use that will inventory, pages. But really what we want to do is assess how good the content is. Now, a lot of times we'll kind of take a piece of that, because when you have websites or apps with tons and tons of content, we want to look at what's the 20% that people are reading, right? Or what's the top 100 pages, right? So we're auditing it, looking at it, doing a gap analysis. Is it actually meeting the needs that you have? You said you had this need. Is it meeting that? We'll also look at competitively. What is the tone and style of your competitors? What are they talking about from a messaging standpoint? And more, I do more and more social work and less big web development these days, but it's still the same. It's like, what's the conversation that's happening, and do you want to be part of it or do you not? And there's not a right or wrong, but you kind of consciously have to make that decision. So that's how we get started, is an audit, inventory, gap analysis. And then from there, we make a recommendation of, based on the current state of what's going on, based on where you want to take your brand online, here's what you need to do. Either you need to, kill this content, update this content, create, these 5 new content features, update your SEO, develop a social presence, whatever that is, that's the recommendation. And from there, we begin that kind of process of making that real.
Right. Are you typically involved? Do you do some of the execution as well, or do you mostly do just the strategic work for folks?
Me personally?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, back earlier in my career, I did the whole gamut. So for example, that Fortune 10 company I worked with, I was their prime content strategist. And we did strategic work ongoing. We did development ongoing. We wrote content. I literally sat every day. Their website, their homepage would change every day. And I had a kind of counterpart there, someone on staff there. We would every morning look at, all right, what's going to be on the homepage, and so on. So we did a lot of strategy, some writing as well. You know, when I was in LA under March 1st, our group was called the Content Strategy and Creation Group. So we had content strategists and we had writers and creators, because not just writers, it's videographers, all of that, right? Now, in some cases, I've also found that writing creative element happens in the creative team. So I've seen both models where, and I kind of explain it as, you see some agencies with more of an agency model where you have writers sitting in creative and they're going to ladder up to be creative directors. Or, and this is my preference, you see more of a publication model or editorial model where you see writers starting out and becoming editors, and I see content strategists more as editors. That's just my view of the world. Some people like to do both. Some people are good at both. I'm much better and more interested in the strategy than the actual writing, but often I have a team of writers that I'm working with. And my role in that is to help make sure that we are creating content that meets the strategic goals.
Right. And I think the way you just articulated that, I haven't heard it put exactly that way, and that's a great way of sorting it out. Like it's sort of like the publisher versus the strategist.
At
the biggest level. But you know, when the clients come to you, they're probably just like, I got a content problem, you got to help me. You know, and they're probably not thinking about those distinctions, I'm going to guess. How do you tell me is that a valid assumption? And if so, how do you walk your clients through that?
Yeah, I mean, it is typically. Let me tell you a story, actually. So when I was at Razorfish, Karen McGrain brought me in 2004 to kind of establish content strategy. So, and she's she's amazing and visionary, and we all know that, but I just have to say that. So in any case, there were 3 amazing copywriters there currently, and I was brought in to really kind of expand upon the work they were doing and really bring in that strategic element. So, you know, one of the things I did, and I've done this many times because I've started numerous content strategy groups or digital strategy groups, is I sat down and I sat down with a project manager or biz dev person and said, all right, how are we selling this? How does it look in the project plan? And I kid you not, I have a screenshot of this today and I use it in presentations. But this one project manager, he said, well, here's how it looks. And you can imagine like a scheduler on a Gantt with lists that say like, here's what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. And it said literally content strategy kickoff. Then it said underneath like content strategy development. And then it said deliver content strategy. And it had random days that I was like, how did you get, like, what do you mean by this? How did you get there? And he's like, I don't know. We just threw it in. And it was like a week of work. And this specific project I worked on for months. It was bringing a Condé Nast magazine online. So there was a lot of content. And it was like 9 months of work. You know, and he had like 2 weeks in there, or a week or whatever. So that's where we started. And I was like, all right, here's how it works. There's actual tasks and things you do. It's not like you just sit around and go, I wonder what the content is. So that's where I start with clients. And I really try to I really try to show them, here's our process, right? We really need to understand what exists, what needs to be there, how do we fill the gap, And so then they start to go, oh, like the light bulbs go off. Oh, this is not just like randomly you just come in and look at our site and it's done. I think the problem, or the challenge rather, is that people don't understand the steps, and having that process is really key, because then we could say, look, here are the things we need to do to get you to where you go. Now, my process has maybe 20 items on it. We don't always do every 20 items, but at least you can see, hey, we're going to focus here. We're going to skip this, but we're consciously skipping it. We're not skipping it because we don't realize we actually have to do it, right? So that's how I typically will interact with clients, is really kind of education, based.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. And the way you just described that, I think almost everybody I've talked to has something like that. You have sort of the super level sort of template and stuff, and you're like, oh, that's fine. They're good there. But boy, we really need to dive in on this step and execute on that. Yeah. Hey, one thing, so we talked a little bit before we went on the air about just the sort of the relationship between between branding, between the top level digital strategy. And how that interacts with, because you talked about this a little bit earlier, about how that interacts with your branding strategy. and how that interacts with your content strategy. There's like, every time I try to do a Venn diagram of that, my brain explodes, because it's more like this 3D sphere. Right. Anyhow, but tell me your take on that, like, or more to the point, maybe how you account for each of those as you're doing any strategy project, whether it's any client work like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I actually, part of Big Thinker Society is I teach classes, and we tackle this all the time, because my theory is that if you have a good strategy in place and a good strategy process, you can use that in whatever way you need. So what I describe strategy as is connecting the dots between the client's business needs, what their brand aspires to be, what the market opportunity is, and what the user needs, right? Those are the key pieces. It's the business brand, the market, and the user, and you have to connect the dots between those three. I don't believe in creating experiences, whether it's a website, an app, a social presence, whatever it is, that are just there to meet the business needs, or just there to fill a market gap, or just there for user needs. It really the magic happens like connecting those three. Now, when we connect those three, sometimes the output is a content strategy, sometimes it's a social strategy, sometimes it's a UX strategy, and we're looking at, functionality, or creating an experience with more of a UX bent, although content certainly is part of UX, right? I think of it features and functionality. The feature piece is content. So that's how I look at it from a higher level, if you will, or a 100,000-foot view. But then you can apply that to what you need to focus on. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And in fact, part of my intent in starting this podcast is like, what the heck is content strategy? Because everybody, it's like everybody talks about it differently.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to develop this hypothesis that it's like this infinitely scalable fractal thing, that you should be strategic at every level. If you're writing an article, you should be strategic about how you approach it. And if you're crafting the content strategy for a Fortune 10 company, you should be strategic. And it's sort of, and you can see it. And like you said, I don't know if there's a similar template at each level, but there's, like that list you have of 20 things that you do when you're crafting a content strategy. Everybody needs that kind of, and I think almost all professionals do, whether they can articulate it or not, have something like that in their head as they operate.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wanted to say that the way I define content strategy is optimizing digital as a communications channel, right? Like that's what we're doing, the communications channel. And just to throw in 30 seconds of what may seem like irrelevant academic babble, but my master's degree is in media studies, and I aspire to be a media ecologist. And media ecology believes that communication technologies, things like the web and mobile and all of that, are the primary driver of social change. Like literally, the web has changed the way that we think. And so anything that we create, experiences we create in the digital space, whether it's, we're talking web, mobile, social, but there's, now there's, in-home devices. I talk to Alexa on a regular basis, or whatever that is, AI, VR. I mean, we could go on. There's always like a thing of the day but whatever that is, digital, that interaction we have changes the way we think. So like, don't you want to use that channel in the most effective way and really optimize it to be authentic, right? You no longer want to just say, throw your brochure online. It's like you actually have an opportunity to optimize who you are and how you interact through that experience, and content's a super key part.
Right. No, that's such a huge thing. I'd love to maybe have a whole other conversation about media ecology, because I'm thinking, have you read Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows?
I haven't, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, because it's like totally in that world. And anyhow, he talks about how media has literally, throughout history, rewired our brains, like the introduction of wristwatches and maps.
Yes, that is media ecology. Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, that is exactly that theory. And it's true. And I mean, I spent 2 years, in a book studying that, but I really try to take that to my work as much as it's relevant. Because I do think you end up with a better product when you can be super authentic to where we're at, right? Like meeting people, the way that they think about, their interaction with digital, you've got to meet that. You can't act like you're a 1950s TV ad. Do you know what I mean? Like it just doesn't work anymore, right? So.
No, and I wonder, it's amazing to me how much that kind of persists, that pushy
Yes,
mentality
yes,
when we're in this
yes,
pull world,
yeah,
and have been for 20 years now.
yes.
Um, yeah. Hey, I just noticed we're coming up. We're just about at 25 minutes. We're coming up close to the end of the time. One thing, let me put this out just to give
Yeah.
you a couple seconds to think about it. One thing I've been asking all my folks is like, is there anything last? Before we wrap up, is there anything that's any recent insight you've had, thought about stuff happening in the world that you'd like to share with folks or tease out a little bit here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking earlier, and I'll touch upon this lightly because I know it's a really controversial topic right now, but we were talking about Facebook and, all the controversy happening there. And I think, the angle that I'm taking on it right now, and maybe I want to write about it, maybe I don't. I'll have to think through it more. But one of the things that's interesting is that, social networks are kind of inherent to socials. So, I've seen a lot of friends online saying, well, I'm going to leave Facebook. Where can I go? And it's a good question. So I actually started doing some of that research, like where can you go? Because there are still old school communities, like the Well, which was the first online community in 1984, 85. I
Yeah.
don't know the exact year, in San Francisco. You can go join that. It's still in existence. It's not a big cost, but there's a subscription model. You can join that. You can go do that. You could do, there are disparate social networks like Diaspora, which has been around for 10 years. The challenge there is you either have to set up your own server to own your data, or you have to go find a pod, which means that you got to find someone you may or may not know to own your data. That also is like just as frightening, right, as anyone
Right.
else owning your data, right? So I think, my take on it is that, and now I'm not talking about the data piece, but I'm kind of talking about, I think that's a whole nother conversation. But this kind of assumption that we have that, that a good experience, which Facebook, I would argue overall offers an amazing experience. They make it look easy. They have, I can't remember what I read the last time, like something like 60,000 servers. I'm sure I'm wrong with that. I mean, they have like immense, with the back end of Facebook is something inconceivable to us. And so, I think it's interesting in some ways that we think of it as a right. Do you know what I mean? Like we should be delivered a really good, social experience. So there's two parts of that. One is like, I think we're being a little bit presumptuous in that like people owe us this. I mean, there's an exchange we have with Facebook, which is we do give them data to get advertising in exchange, just like TV, just like everything else. That's how it works, right? So good or bad, you don't have to be on Facebook. No one's making you do that, but that's kind of how it is. And you either sign up for that or you don't. But if you don't, there's not that many alternatives. That's not to say someone shouldn't create an alternative. I think we're ready and open for it. But I find it interesting. Just the reaction. I think that's what I'm trying to say is just watching and observing the reaction of people, who's upset, who's not upset, the assumptions made, I'm going to leave, I'm not going to leave. And I'll just end on this, the kind of the, how closely we hold it. Like people are really upset and they're upset about their data, but also this like, do I have to break up with Facebook? And I think when we talk about from a media ecology standpoint and the fact that like, this is how we connect with each other today. Like, it's just fascinating. I mean, Facebook has 2 billion people. Like if millions of people leave, they're fine. You know what I mean? And again, I'm not saying you should stay. I'm not saying you should leave. I get it. If you're upset, totally understand. I think it's interesting to observe how kind of the emotional reaction we're having. So
right.
That's
no, and I like the way that, like, oh, do I have to break up with Facebook? I think that's how a lot of people look at it, and that's the tenor of the conversation. Because I'm still there, like, but only 5 or 10 minutes a day now because I feel like I have to be there. A couple quick things that I just want to interject for folks who are listening to this. long after the fact that we're recording this the week that the Cambridge Analytica story broke about the data breach at Facebook. So that's the context for that. Also, I just want to say there's been so much, not just for me, this is like the most recent in a long string of conversations. I saw Derek Thompson of the Atlantic Monthly did a talk here in Seattle about 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, and he was talking about just how he was the first person I heard talk about the need that maybe government should be regulating Facebook. That it is like you were talking about the entitlement part of it. That it is like a utility. That it probably should be regulated like a public utility. So that's an interesting angle on it. There's also I've heard a lot of people like Jaron Lanier and others talk about how as long as Facebook has our attention and is selling it to other people, we're screwed. That's like.
I'm sorry, say that again. As long as it has our attention.
As long as Facebook holds our attention, which is the scarcest commodity in this modern economy, and is selling it to other people, that's their whole business model, and that we're kind of like not, as consumers anyway, that's not the best situation. But in that realm, there's a lot going on. Tim Berners-Lee is doing a thing at MIT. Yeah. He's just one of many people working on this idea that we could, and I don't know, this is just a concept at this point, but I hold out hope that some clever person will make it happen.
Yeah.
That we could have like a little social media place, like your WordPress site or something analogous, something that you control, that you host, you have control of like who sees what, and you control the data, and
But we had bulletin board systems. We had all of that. We have it now. People don't use it because it's a pain to use. It's a lot of maintenance, and people don't want that. They want an easy way to connect. Yeah. So I would argue so my view on media, and I'm a big fan of teaching kids about media. My kids are like, they know the difference between an advertisement and content, and whether we're watching CNN or, well, we don't watch Fox, but they get it. They get that media is biased, and that that's good to know. Like, so it's biased. This is the view they're giving me, so I can filter that. And I really believe, like, when we're adults, that it's there's a level of responsibility that's on us. Like, to your point, you only go on Facebook a few times a day because that's what you are responsible for and comfortable with, right? Like, I can set my privacy settings. I can, it's like when my phone rings, I don't have to pick it up. My phone does not control my life. Do you know what I mean? Like, even if it's an important call, I can look at it and go, I'll get it later. And that's what I feel like we have this kind of immature approach in this country, because we've always had this sense of like the media is unbiased, which is totally a lie. I mean, we tried that, but in like Europe, for example, there are 10 newspapers in a big city, and each one says like, hey, I'm the super liberal paper, I'm the super conservative, and you either pick up the one you want or you pick up one you don't agree with, but you're reading it knowing. But we have this like almost like kid-like view that like media should have some responsibility to us, like in a way that almost is irresponsible. Mm-hmm. So I think part of that is like teaching in schools, teaching kids, like, here's how you could use the media. I mean, what's happening in Parkland, like, those kids are unreal because they know how to use the media. They get it, right? And they're responsible for it. So I don't know. I feel like that is missing from the conversation. Like, Facebook, I guess that's what I'm saying. Like, Facebook owes me nothing, right? Like, I choose to be on Facebook. I'm an active Facebook user. I get that because I also am in this business, I totally know the backside. I use Facebook advertising. I get it. I consciously do it. For better or worse, that's my choice. I'm an adult. I get to make it. And so that's where I get stuck on like, no one's beholden to it.
Yeah.
And you have the options.
Yeah. And then the other thing, and you kind of, there was one last thing I was going to say. That
sorry.
No, I love that. That's good. No, I love the passion. And, but the one other thing is that, I don't know if maybe a distributed social network could ever accomplish. Yeah. But like, I don't know if you know Jonathan Coleman at Facebook.
Yes, absolutely.
He's awesome. A buddy of mine. Yeah. And they care a lot about usability, and they're constantly optimizing that user experience. And so that's something that they're always going to have that may be harder to, like, I remember the old Usenet bulletin boards, they were not super usable, whereas Facebook really is. So
and I mean, there is Reddit. you can go to Reddit, right? I mean, I don't know their privacy settings and data, but anyways, there's
Yeah, no,
options.
exactly. Yeah. Well, but that's interesting because you're like, I'm also just one last thing I want to say. I don't know if
Yeah,
you know Robert Cialdini's book, The Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, where he
I
talks about,
do. Yeah.
yeah, those weapons of influence. And
Yes.
this conversation we just had reminds me of like that. I love that book because as a marketer, it gives you all the weapons you need to
Yeah.
influence people.
Right.
But as a
Right.
consumer, it empowers you
That's right.
to defend
That's right.
yourself.
That's
So, yeah. And I think
exactly.
that sounds like you're
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that. I think we need more of it in schools. If I ever became independently wealthy, I mean, I think that would be a passion project for me, is to really create, media education. I think it's really important. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Like more media literacy, please.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Totally.
great.
Yeah.
Well, fun. Well, this has been great, Laura. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. And yeah, and like I said, there's a whole bunch more in here. Maybe we'll talk again in a few months and revisit some of
Sure.
this. Yeah. All right.
Good
Thanks
fun.
again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.